In a dusty auction yard under the September sun, a former railroad surveyor was about to make a purchase that would threaten the most powerful man in the territory. What started as bargain hunting among discarded freight equipment took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a broken wagon that held secrets worth killing for. Juniper Hart wasn't your typical auction bidder. For 5 years she had spent her life drawing maps for the railroad, measuring grades and calculating loads, known for her refusal to falsify dangerous surveys, even when it cost her steady work. When she encountered the weathered freight wagon sitting apart from other lots, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that stretched across 300 square miles. Hart paid 4/4 for what appeared to be junk that would lead to the discovery of a hidden archive documenting every water source in the territory. What began as a $1 gamble would become a battle for the soul of the American West. The territory would never be the same after a woman with surveyor's eyes decided that some knowledge was too valuable to hide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction yard stretched like a bone field under the September sun. Juniper Hart stood with her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, watching folks pick through the scattered remnants of failed homesteads and busted freight operations. Wagons, plows, and water barrels sat in crooked rows, each piece tagged with a lot number and the desperate hope of turning junk into cash. She'd bought rusted train cars left on the prairie for $5 before. What she'd found inside had stunned whole towns, but this wasn't a train car. This was something else entirely. The freight wagon sat apart from the other lots, its weathered wood bleached gray as old bone. One wheel canted at a sick angle where the axle had snapped, and the canvas top hung in tatters like a flag of surrender. The auctioneer had barely glanced at it when he called Lot 47, freight wagon sold as is, no warranty. June's trained eye traced the lines of the frame while other bidders drifted toward shinier prospects. She'd spent 5 years drawing maps for the railroad, measuring grades and calculating loads, before she'd refused to falsify a survey on a dangerous mountain cut. That refusal had cost her steady work, but it had sharpened her ability to read the bones of any wheeled thing. This wagon was wrong in interesting ways. The joinery along the sideboards showed hand-cut dovetails where machine work should have been. Carved chevrons ran in patterns that looked random until she realized they followed prevailing wind directions. The wood itself was desert ironwood, too expensive for ordinary freight, too heavy for speed. $1, she called when the auctioneer's gavel hovered. The yard fell quiet except for wind rattling through broken spokes. Folks turned to stare, and June caught the expressions she'd grown used to, pity mixed with the satisfaction of watching someone else make a fool's bargain. $1 for the lady with excellent timing, called Sheriff Boyd Mallory from near the clerk's table. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd kept peace in a county where peace meant choosing which fights to lose. Though I'd advise checking your reasons twice, Miss Hart. Silas Rook's been buying up every water-hauling rig between here and the territorial line. June counted out 4/4 and placed them in the clerk's palm. I know what I'm buying, Sheriff. Do you? Mallory's weathered face showed genuine concern. Because last I checked, that thing's been sitting in Widow Morrison's backlot for 3 years. Nothing but a home for mice and bad weather. The clerk scratched June's name onto a receipt with a steel nib that caught and spattered. Behind him, a few lingerers shook their heads at the waste of good money. June had earned those 4/4 hauling water for the Patterson family and mending harness for anyone willing to pay a woman to do leather work. But she'd also spent those 3 years studying the Morrison lot every time she'd passed through town. She'd noted how the wagon's bulk cast shadows that shifted wrong for its apparent construction. She'd watched how prairie grass grew differently in patches around the wheels, greener in some spots, stunted in others, as if something in the wagon's construction altered drainage patterns. "That's yours, miss," the clerk said, handing her the crumpled receipt. "Though, I'd strip it for parts before winter. That axle split clean through." June approached her purchase while the crowd dispersed toward more sensible lots. Up close, the damage looked worse. The left rear wheel had folded inward, where the iron tire had burst, and the axle showed a clean break that spoke more of deliberate sabotage than wear. But her fingers found the chevron carvings again, and she realized they weren't decorative. They were directional markers. A wet nose nudged her elbow, followed by the familiar sound of Semaphor's skeptical snort. Her pack mule had wandered over from the livery where she'd left him with a nosebag, and his dark eyes fixed on the wagon, with what June had learned to recognize as mule disapproval. "I know it looks rough," she told him, scratching behind his ears, "but sometimes the roughest things hide the most careful work." Semaphor flicked his ears and walked a slow circle around the wagon, pausing to sniff at the broken axle. His inspection method differed from June's, but reached similar conclusions. This thing was built to confuse casual observers. "Easy, boy," June murmured, as Semaphor approached the wagon bed. Mules possessed an unfortunate talent for kicking expensive things at precisely the wrong moment. But instead of creating chaos, Semaphor's investigation revealed something June had missed. When his rear hoof struck the underside of the wagon bed, while he investigated a particularly interesting scent, a metallic click echoed from beneath the boards. June dropped to her knees in the dust, peering up into the wagon's shadowed undercarriage. The broken axle had shifted just enough to reveal what her surveyor's eye should have caught immediately. The proportions were wrong. The space between the wagon bed and the actual frame measured 3 inches deeper on the left side than the right, a hidden compartment. And something inside it was rattling. The sun touched the horizon as the last auction lot sold to farmers and merchants. Mallory approached while June still crouched beneath the wagon, running her fingers along seams that proved too regular for accident. "Find anything interesting down there?" he asked. "Maybe." June emerged with dust in her hair and brass shavings on her fingertips. "Sheriff, you said Rook's been buying water equipment. Any particular reason why?" Mallory's expression tightened. "Same reason any man with money buys things in drought years. Control the supply, name the price." He paused, watching her dust off her hands. "That wagon came through during the Morrison estate sale. Widow claimed her husband bought it off a Mexican woman heading south. Never said why she was in such a hurry to sell. Mexican woman spoke perfect English, carried herself like educated folk. Morrison said she had maps and measuring tools, looked like she'd been surveying. But that was 4 years back, and memory gets creative." June filed the information while she calculated how to move a wagon with a split axle. The brake looked clean enough for a temporary repair, but she'd need proper tools and a steady workspace. "I'll have it dragged to the livery," she decided. "Work on it there. Just remember what I said about Rook." Mallory touched his hat brim. "Man's got patience like winter ice, but he doesn't forget things that interest him." As the sheriff walked away, June studied her purchase in the failing light. The carved chevrons caught shadows that made them look like arrows pointing in directions that didn't quite match the compass. And the brass click when Semaphor's hoof hit the undercarriage suggested mechanisms more complex than a simple hidden box. She'd bought plenty of broken things over the years. Windmill gears that needed retooling, pump mechanisms that required patient cleaning and adjustment, water barrels with leak-stopped seams that held perfectly once the repair was properly done. But she'd never bought something that seemed designed to hide its own purpose. Night settled over the auction yard while June arranged for Tom Bradley's draft horses to drag the wagon to her workshop stall at Morrison's livery. The move went smoothly enough, though the broken axle made steering impossible, and the whole rig wanted to slide sideways on even the gentlest slopes. By lamplight, with Semaphor munching hay in the neighboring stall, June began her real examination of the day's purchase. The lantern cast wavering shadows across the wagon's interior, while June worked beneath the false bed with a pry bar and 20 years of mechanical intuition. The hidden compartment extended the full length of the wagon bed, divided into sections by carefully fitted partitions that slid on brass runners worn smooth with use. What emerged challenged every assumption she'd made about the wagon's previous owner. The first drawer contained glass photographic plates wrapped in oiled cloth, each negative showing landscapes she didn't recognize. River courses, spring locations, underground seepages marked with careful annotations in a precise hand. The images had been taken from elevated positions, showing water sources in relation to landmark rocks and distant peaks. The second drawer held cipher wheels, brass discs with rotating alphabets that could encode and decode messages, along with seed envelopes labeled in 3 languages. Spanish, she could puzzle through. English was straightforward. The third script looked like the writing she'd seen on the few dîner blankets that made their way to trading posts, though she couldn't read the symbols. The third drawer stopped her completely, a compact wind-driven pump head, its vanes precisely balanced, and its housing machined to tolerances she'd seen only in the finest railroad equipment. The device showed wear patterns that spoke of extensive field testing and modifications that improved on standard designs she'd learned while surveying irrigation prospects for the territorial government. Someone had spent considerable time and money developing better ways to pull water from difficult ground. June spread the contents across her workbench, using survey tools to measure and map what she'd found. The glass plates, when held to lamplight, revealed delicate vein lines that looked like underground watercourses. The seed envelopes contained varieties she couldn't identify: drought-resistant grasses, root vegetables adapted to alkaline soil, legumes that might fix nitrogen in sandy ground. The cipher wheels bore a maker's mark she almost missed. I Salgado etched in script so small it required her surveyor's magnifying lens to read clearly. Below the name, a spiral glyph that matched symbols carved into the wagon's sidewall chevrons. June aligned one cipher wheel with the chevron pattern and found letters resolving into coordinates. Not the township and range system she knew from railroad surveying, but compass bearings and distance measurements that used landmarks she'd seen in the glass plate photographs. The mysterious Mexican woman had been mapping water sources across a territory larger than most counties. By midnight, June had assembled enough pieces to understand the wagon's purpose. It was a mobile archive, a traveling library of hydrological information disguised as damaged freight equipment. The false bed contained documentation of springs, aquifers, and water table depths across hundreds of square miles. Someone had spent years gathering this information. Someone had invested in precision equipment and careful storage methods. Someone had hidden it all in a wagon designed to look worthless to casual inspection. And someone had been forced to abandon it in desperate circumstances. June studied the maker's mark again, committing the spiral glyph to memory. The name Salgado suggested the Mexican connection Sheriff Mallory had mentioned, but the precision of the work suggested formal training in engineering or natural sciences. The coordinates encoded in the chevron patterns showed mathematical sophistication that required advanced education, which raised the question, why hide such valuable information in a broken wagon? The answer came with dawn light streaming through the livery's east-facing door. June was examining the pump head's internal mechanisms when she heard boots on the plank flooring and turned to find Sheriff Mallory approaching with coffee and a concerned expression. "You've been here all night," he observed, noting the lantern burned down to fumes and the mechanical parts spread across her work area. "Found some interesting reading material," June replied, carefully positioning herself between Mallory and the glass plates. Not from distrust, but from caution born of experience with valuable information in disputed territory. Mallory set a steaming cup beside her elbow and studied what he could see of her discoveries without pushing closer than courtesy allowed. His lawman's eyes caught details that mattered: the precision of the brasswork, the quality of the glass plates, the care with which everything had been stored and preserved. "Looks like surveying equipment," he said finally. "Sophisticated surveying equipment," June agreed. "The kind that measures things people pay good money to control." Mallory's expression grew troubled. "Things like water sources." "Exactly like water sources." June sipped the coffee gratefully, her mind working through implications and possibilities. Sheriff, what do you know about territorial water rights law? Enough to know it's complicated and getting more so every year. Prior appropriation law, Tim says first use establishes rights, but proving first use gets murky when you're talking about springs and aquifers that have been used by indigenous people for centuries. June nodded. And when someone with good lawyers and better financing decides to claim every water source in a region, then folks like you and me better hope we're not standing between him and what he wants. Mallory finished his coffee and set the cup aside. Miss Hart, I'm going to give you some free advice. Whatever you found in that wagon, consider very carefully who needs to know about it. After Mallory left, June continued her examination of the archive. The glass plates, when arranged according to the coordinates encoded in the cipher wheels, revealed a network of springs and underground water courses that extended across the territory in patterns that defied the surface geography she knew. The seed envelopes contained varieties specifically selected for restoration of damaged rangeland. The pump head incorporated innovations that could lift water from depths previously considered impossible for wind-powered equipment. Someone named Salgado had developed a comprehensive plan for sustainable water management across a drought-prone region. Someone had documented the information with scientific precision and hidden it in a wagon designed to escape notice. Someone, probably Silas Rook, had reasons for wanting that information to disappear permanently. June wrapped the glass plates in fresh oiled cloth and secured the cipher wheels in a leather satchel. The pump head went into a canvas tool roll. Cushioned against damage, she needed help interpreting the indigenous script on the seed envelopes, and she needed to understand the full scope of what Salgado had documented, which meant finding people who could read landscapes the way she read mechanical drawings. Ada Bluebird's loom occupied the best light in her small adobe house, positioned where morning sun struck the warped threads at perfect angles for color work. June found her weaving a pattern that seemed to shift and flow like water over stone blues deepening to indigo, greens brightening to the exact shade of spring grass after rain. The sheriff's wife sent you, Ada said without looking up from her shuttle work. It wasn't a question. In a town the size of Clearwater, interesting visitors followed predictable paths of introduction. She said you might recognize some symbols I found. June sat on the offered stool and unwrapped the paper rubbings she'd made of the wagon's carved chevrons, traditional water signs maybe. Ada's hands stilled on the loom. Her dark eyes studied the patterns June spread across her work table, and her expression shifted from polite attention to sharp focus. Where did you find these? Carved into a freight wagon I bought yesterday, along with some other things that suggest someone was mapping water sources across the territory. Ada set aside her shuttle and moved closer to the rubbings. Her fingers traced the chevron patterns without touching the paper, following lines that June had thought were decorative elements. These aren't just water signs, Ada said finally. They're teaching patterns, wayfinding for people who need to read landscapes, not just follow marked trails. She pointed to a series of connected chevrons that formed a chain across one of the rubbings. This shows seasonal flow direction. The depth of the carving indicates strength of source. Deep cuts for springs that run year-round, shallow marks for seasonal seeps. June compared the rubbings to her survey notes from the glass plates. The coordinates match water sources I found documented in photographs. Springs and aquifers across maybe 300 square miles of territory. Someone taught you to read land features for your railroad work, Ada observed. But this kind of knowledge comes from different teaching. Older teach. She moved to a cedar chest and returned with a bundle of woven strips, each showing patterns similar to the wagon's carvings, but executed in wool dyed with colors. June couldn't identify. The weavings looked old, but the dyes remained vivid. My grandmother's sister worked these before the cavalry came through in '64. They show the connections between springs and the animals that depend on them, the plants that indicate good water, the signs that warn of alkali or seasonal failure. Ada spread 3 of the woven strips beside June's rubbings, and the relationship became clear. The carved chevrons weren't isolated symbols, they were part of a comprehensive system for recording and transmitting hydrological knowledge. Someone learned traditional teaching and combined it with Mexican mapping methods. Ada said, "The precision work of an engineer married to water knowledge that goes back centuries." June studied the comparisons, her surveyor's training allowing her to appreciate both the technical sophistication and the cultural synthesis represented by the carvings. The person who made this, Salgado, based on a maker's mark I found. They understood that water doesn't follow territorial boundaries or property deeds. Water follows older laws. Ada rewrapped her grandmother's weavings with careful attention to folding patterns, laws that require sharing, not hoarding. A shadow crossed the window, and both women looked up to see a rider on the road, moving slowly enough to be studying the house rather than simply passing through. The man wore the kind of clothes that suggested steady wages and access to town amenities, not a rancher or freighter, but someone with business interests. "You know him?" June asked. Ada shook her head. "But I know the type, men who watch and remember and report to people with money." June gathered her rubbings while considering her options. The archive in the wagon represented knowledge that could benefit every rancher and farmer in the territory, information about water sources, sustainable pumping methods, and drought-resistant crops. But it also represented a threat to anyone who profited from water scarcity. "Ada, if someone wanted to use this information to help people instead of controlling them, what would that look like?" Ada considered the question while her hands automatically resumed the rhythm of weaving. "Traditional teaching says water knowledge belongs to everyone who needs it, but it also says such knowledge requires guardians, people willing to ensure it's used wisely. Guardians. People who understand that hoarding water kills the land that produces it. People who know that springs can be managed to flow stronger or depleted to failure, depending on how they're used." The rider outside had stopped, his attention clearly focused on the house. June made her decision. "I need to show this to other people, people who can help implement what Salgado documented. But I need proof it works first." Ada nodded. "You need to demonstrate restoration of damaged ground. Show that the traditional knowledge works with the engineering knowledge." "Exactly. Do you know anyone with failed rangerland who might be willing to let us test the pump system?" "Ruthie Calder has a patch that's been dead since the drought of '89. Lost her grass, lost her topsoil, barely keeps her stock alive on what she can haul from town." Ada's shuttle moved through the warp threads with practiced precision. She'd listened to proof, but she's been fooled by miracle solutions before. June stood tucking the rubbings into her jacket. "Then we'd better make sure our proof is undeniable." As she stepped toward the door, Ada's voice stopped her. "June, if you're going to make this knowledge public, you need to understand what you're choosing. There are people with significant investments in water scarcity. People who won't appreciate losing control of something they consider profitable." June looked back at the loom, where Ada's pattern continued to flow like water over stone, blues and greens, in patterns that encoded generations of carefully preserved knowledge. "I understand," she said. "But some things are too important to hide." Outside, the watching rider had moved on, but June could feel the weight of attention that would only increase as word spread about her unusual purchase and her visits to people who might help interpret what she'd found. The wagon waited in the livery stall, its archive of spring locations and pumping innovations ready to demonstrate whether Salgado's vision of cooperative water management could work in practice. Whether it would be allowed to work depended on how quickly June could build proof that would convince an entire community to stand against the kind of pressure that men like Silas Rook knew how to apply. Time to find out if dead ground could bloom again when the right knowledge met willing hands. Ruthie Calder's pasture stretched like a scar across what had once been good grazing land. The drought of '89 had killed the grass, and 7 years of wind had carried away the topsoil, leaving behind hard pan that shed water like hammered metal. Ruthie stood with her arms crossed, watching June and Ada unload the compact pump from the wagon, while a thin man in wire spectacles calibrated the device's brass fittings. Leon Wen, the man had introduced himself earlier, offering a firm handshake and a slight bow. I repair clocks and windmills. Miss Bluebird thought my mechanical experience might prove useful. June had accepted the help gratefully. The pump head's precision construction required delicate adjustment of vane angles and gear ratios, and Leon's steady hands and engineer's eye made quick work of connections that would have taken her hours to puzzle through. "Ground's been dead since my husband passed," Ruthie said, her voice carrying the flatness of old grief mixed with newer skepticism. "Tried everything, chicken wire to break the wind, hauling manure from the livery, even hired a diviner with copper rods who swore he could find water at 8 feet. She gestured toward a depression near the fence line where someone had started digging a well and given up when the hole filled with alkaline seepage instead of clean water. "Found water, all right, just not the kind that grows anything but salt weeds." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. June consulted the glass plate negatives, holding them to the afternoon light, while Ada compared the chevron patterns to the landscape features visible from their position. According to Salgado's documentation, fresh water should run beneath this ground at a depth of 12 to 15 feet, following a fault line that connected to a spring complex 6 miles to the northwest. "Lang, what do you think about that old hole for our test site?" June asked. The clockmaker examined the failed well with the same methodical attention he applied to gear trains and escapement mechanisms. He dropped a weighted string to measure depth, tested the remaining water for mineral content by taste and smell, and studied the soil layers exposed in the excavation. "Previous digger stopped at the alkali layer," he concluded. "But the stratification suggests deeper aquifer. The surface seepage masks better water below." Lang's assessment matched Salgado's documentation. The glass plates showed this area as part of a network where shallow alkaline water overlay deeper fresh sources, a hydrogeological puzzle that required precise depth calculations to solve. "We'll need to go deeper," June decided. "Clean out the alkali layer and punch through to the sweet water below." Ruthie's expression shifted from skepticism toward cautious interest. "You're talking about digging 15 feet through hardpan and alkaline mud. That's 2 days' work for a crew and no guarantee you'll find anything but more salt water." "We're not digging," Ada said, positioning a windsock according to the directional markers carved into the wagon's sidewall. "We're pumping." June and Lang had modified the wind-driven pump head to function as both a drilling aid and a water lifter. The device's rotating shaft could drive a narrow auger to penetrate packed earth, while the pumping mechanism cleared debris and tested water quality at each depth. The modification represented a synthesis of railroad engineering, traditional ecological knowledge, and Salgado's innovations in wind-powered machinery. If it worked, they could prove the archive's value with minimal labor and maximum precision. If it failed, they'd have wasted a day and confirmed Ruthie's suspicions about miracle solutions. "Winds steady from the northwest," Ada observed, checking the alignment of her positioning markers against the chevron patterns. "Direction matches the traditional indicators for this season." Leon made final adjustments to the vane angles, his movements precise as a watchmaker's. The pump head caught the wind with a whisper that built to a steady humming as the internal mechanisms found their operating rhythm. June operated the controls that lowered the auger into the failed well, feeling the device bite through layers of hard pan and alkaline sediment. At 8 feet, the resistance changed, softer material that might indicate clay or organic deposit. At 12 feet, the auger hit something that made the pump head shudder, and the humming shift to a deeper note. "Water table," Liang announced, studying pressure readings on gauges he'd adapted from steam equipment. But quality unknown. The first water that rose through the pump lines ran muddy and bitter, confirming the presence of the alkaline layer that had defeated previous attempts. But June continued the process, using the wind-driven mechanism to clear sediment and debris, while the auger opened a pathway to deeper sources. At 14 feet, the water changed. Clear, sweet, cold enough to suggest underground flow rather than surface seepage. June filled a cup and offered it to Ruthie, who tasted it with the caution of someone who'd been disappointed before. Ruthie's eyes widened. "That's better water than I get from the town well." Word traveled fast in ranch country. By sunset, a dozen neighbors had gathered to watch the steady stream flowing from ground that had been barren for 7 years. The pumphead continued its quiet work, driven by wind that seemed to blow stronger as evening approached. "Pressure's holding steady," Liang reported, monitoring the gauges he'd installed to track flow rates and aquifer response. "No drawdown after 4 hours of pumping. Indicates substantial underground reserve." June took measurements and made notes in a ledger book, recording data that would support or refute Salgado's documentation. Flow rate, mineral content, consistency over time, information that could prove the archive's value to skeptics who demanded evidence beyond stories and tradition. Elijah Lash Booker arrived as the sun touched the horizon, driving a freight wagon loaded with materials for what he called community infrastructure. His broad smile and easy manner drew people into conversation, but June noticed how his questions gathered information about water sources, land ownership, and local politics. "Heard you folks found a way to make dead ground bloom," he said, accepting a cup of the cold well water from Ruthie. "That's the kind of news that travels fast in drought country." June studied Lash while he examined the pump setup with an engineer's appreciation for efficient design. "You're not here by accident." "No, Matt. I run a freighting cooperative, small ranchers and farmers who pool resources for supply runs and marketing. We've been looking for ways to help members develop water resources without going into debt to the big operators." Lash's cooperative model intrigued June. Instead of individual ranchers competing for scarce resources, his organization promoted shared costs and collective problem-solving. The approach aligned with the philosophy she'd found encoded in Salgado's archive, water management, as community responsibility rather than individual extraction. "How many members in your cooperative?" Ada asked. 43 families between here and the territorial line, most working marginal land that used to be good grazing before the drought years. Lash gestured toward the steady flow from Ruthie's restored well. "Something like this could change the economics for every one of them." June made a decision that felt both inevitable and dangerous. "Lash, what would it take to organize a demonstration for your cooperative members? Something that shows how the archive information could benefit the whole region." "Archive information?" June exchanged glances with Ada, who nodded slightly. Trust had to start somewhere, and Lash's cooperative model suggested alignment with the values they'd found embedded in Salgado's work. "We found documentation for water sources across 300 square miles of territory, spring locations, aquifer depths, pumping techniques, even seed varieties selected for drought resistance and soil restoration." Lash set down his cup and studied the 3 women with renewed attention. "That kind of information would be worth considerable money to the right buyers, or worth more to the right community," Ada said firmly. June appreciated the distinction. Information sold to buyers became proprietary advantage. Information shared with community became collective resource. The difference determined whether Salgado's archive served extraction or restoration. "The documentation includes detailed maps," June continued. "Locations of springs, seasonal flow patterns, underground connections between water sources. Someone spent years gathering this information with scientific precision, someone who disappeared rather suddenly," Ada added, leaving the archive hidden in a wagon that was sold for scrap. Lash absorbed the implications while watching the pumphead continue its steady work in the gathering darkness. And now someone else is interested in controlling water sources across the territory. "Silas Rook," June confirmed. "The sheriff warned me that Rook's been buying up water equipment and filing claims on every spring he can document, which means your archive represents competition for his monopoly plans." Lash's expression grew serious. "Miss Hart, you're talking about information that could make or break fortunes. That puts everyone involved at considerable risk." June had been thinking about risk since her conversation with Sheriff Mallory. The archive contained knowledge that could benefit every farmer and rancher in the territory, but revealing it would challenge the interests of people with resources to defend their advantages. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "Hide the information and let Rook claim every water source through legal manipulation. Watch small operators fail while he builds a monopoly on something people need to survive." Ruthie stepped closer to the conversation, her face showing the first hope June had seen since their introduction. "This pump's been running 6 hours. My stock tank is full for the first time in 2 years, and the overflow's already softening ground that's been hard as brick." She gestured toward patches of earth, where the steady flow had begun to penetrate the hard pan surface. "If this works here, it'll work on other damaged ground. But only if people know about it." Lash studied the restored well, the pump mechanism and the faces of the women who'd accomplished something that challenged conventional wisdom about failed rangerland. His decision-making process showed the same methodical approach June had observed in successful engineers and competent traders. "I can organize a gathering," he said finally, "cooperative members plus other interested parties. But it'll need to be public and documented if you want to establish community ownership of the information." "Public documentation is exactly what we need," June agreed. "The archive works best when it's shared knowledge, not hidden advantage." As the group made plans for a larger demonstration, June felt the weight of commitment settling around her like a familiar harness. She'd bought a broken wagon for $1 and found herself responsible for knowledge that could reshape the economic foundation of water rights across the territory. Whether that responsibility led to community benefit or personal disaster depended on how quickly they could build proof that skeptics couldn't dismiss and opposition couldn't suppress. Main Street lay quiet under the October morning sun when Jonah Pike stepped down from his bay mare and tied her to the rail outside the sheriff's office. His movements carried the deliberate precision of a man accustomed to making problems disappear without unnecessary noise or witnesses. Pike had arrived in Clearwater 3 days after word reached Silas Rook about unusual activity around water development in the territory. As Rook's quiet hand, Pike specialized in resolving conflicts before they required expensive legal action or unwanted public attention. Sheriff Mallory emerged from his office as Pike approached, the lawman's face showing the resignation of someone who recognized trouble in well-tailored clothing. "Mr. Pike, heard you might be visiting our county, Sheriff Mallory." Pike touched his hat brim with practiced courtesy. "Beautiful morning for conducting business." Pike carried a leather portfolio containing documents that would settle the matter of June Hart's unusual wagon and its contents without requiring violence or dramatic confrontation. Rook preferred elegant solutions, legal pressure that achieved desired outcomes while maintaining respectability. "I assume you're here about the Hart woman and her recent purchase," Mallory said. Among other things, Pike opened his portfolio and extracted papers bearing official seals and precise legal language. "County inspector's report on unsafe mechanical equipment operating without proper permits. Public safety concern requiring immediate impoundment." Mallory accepted the documents with reluctance born of experience. Pike's paperwork always proved technically correct, filed through proper channels, and impossible to challenge without resources most people couldn't afford. Equipment in question being the freight wagon Miss Hart bought at legal auction. Equipment being the experimental pumping apparatus she's been operating on private property without engineering certification or safety inspection. Pike's tone remained conversational, but his meaning was clear. Apparatus that could pose significant risk to groundwater quality and public health. The documents described June's wind-driven pump in language that made it sound like a dangerous industrial mechanism rather than a precision instrument for sustainable water extraction. Technical terms and regulatory citations created an impression of serious violations requiring immediate official response. "You're impounding the wagon," Mallory concluded. "I'm requesting that local law enforcement secure potentially hazardous equipment until proper authorities can conduct safety evaluation." Pike's correction emphasized the cooperative nature of the action. Standard procedure for protecting community welfare. Mallory studied the paperwork while considering his limited options. Pike's documents bore legitimate signatures and referenced actual regulations. Challenging the impoundment would require legal expertise and financial resources that exceeded the county's budget. And if Miss Hart objects to this safety evaluation, then we'll discuss alternative arrangements that serve everyone's interests. Pike's smile suggested confidence in his ability to reach reasonable accommodation. Rook believes in resolving disputes through negotiation rather than confrontation. The impoundment order would remove the wagon and its contents from June's control, while Rook's legal team constructed a more permanent solution. Property rights, safety regulations, and water law offered multiple avenues for establishing ownership of any valuable information the wagon might contain. Pike understood that information, not machinery, represented the real prize. June Hart's restoration of Ruthie Calder's failed well suggested access to hydrological data that could be worth millions in the right hands. Data that Rook intended to control before it could complicate his territorial water acquisition plans. "I'll need to serve notice on Miss Hart before impounding her property," Mallory said. "Of course, due process protects everyone's rights." Pike replaced the documents in his portfolio, though I should mention that Miss Rook would consider it a personal favor if this matter could be resolved without extensive publicity. The threat was politely worded, but unmistakable. Rook had resources to make life difficult for sheriffs who failed to cooperate with reasonable requests. Campaign contributions, judicial appointments, and territorial political connections provided leverage that most local officials couldn't match. Mallory nodded, with the bitter understanding of a man who'd learned to choose his battles carefully. "I'll handle the impoundment this afternoon." Pike touched his hat brim again and turned toward his horse, satisfied that the first phase of conflict resolution was proceeding according to plan. The wagon would be secured, its contents examined, and June Hart would face a choice between cooperation and financial ruin. Most people chose cooperation when the alternatives were properly explained. June received the impoundment notice at Morrison's livery while she was preparing the wagon for transport to Lash Booker's cooperative demonstration. The official document cited mechanical safety violations and unauthorized engineering modifications, requiring immediate surrender of the equipment for evaluation by territorial authorities. "How long for this evaluation?" she asked Mallory, who delivered the notice with obvious reluctance. No specific timeline mentioned. Could be weeks or months, depending on the backlog of cases requiring official review. June understood the strategy immediately. Indefinite delay while Rook's legal team constructed permanent claims on the wagon's contents. By the time any appeals worked through territorial courts, the archive information would be thoroughly documented and filed under Rook's ownership. "And if I refuse to surrender the wagon, then I'd have to arrest you for violating a lawful impoundment order." Mallory's expression showed his distaste for the situation. "Miss Hart, I'd strongly advise compliance with official procedures." June studied the notice while considering her options. Legal challenge would require lawyers she couldn't afford and time she didn't have. Resistance would result in jail and give Rook uncontested access to the archive. Compliance meant losing control of information that could benefit every water-dependent operation in the territory. None of the alternatives looked promising. "Sheriff, what happens to impounded property? Where is it stored and who has access?" "Locked in the county equipment yard behind the courthouse. Only myself and the deputy have keys." Mallory paused, his tone careful. "Though authorized officials can request supervised examination for evaluation purpose," which meant Rook's people would have access to the wagon within days. They'd photograph the glass plates, decode the cipher wheels, and map every spring location documented in Salgado's archive. By the time June regained possession, if she ever did, the information would be worthless as community resource. "I need to remove my personal tools before impoundment," June said. "That's reasonable, 1 hour to clear your personal property." June worked quickly, removing obvious surveying equipment while leaving the archived materials in their hidden compartments. But she also made careful note of every detail about the false bed's construction, the arrangement of the glass plates, and the encoding system used in the cipher wheels. If Rook wanted Salgado's archive, he'd get the physical artifacts, but the information itself could be recreated from memory and documentation June had already made. As Mallory supervised the wagon's removal to the county yard, June found herself facing the kind of choice that defined character under pressure. Accept defeat and let valuable knowledge disappear into private ownership, or find ways to preserve and share information that belonged to the community. The decision felt inevitable. That evening, June met with Ada, Liang, and Lash at Sister Regis Doyle's mission garden, where the nun maintained detailed records of rainfall, crop yields, and community health statistics. The mission's location outside town limits provided privacy for conversations that might be overheard elsewhere. They have the wagon, June reported, but they don't have everything. She spread hand-copied maps and notes across Agnes's work table, showing spring locations, aquifer depths, and pumping specifications recreated from her study of Salgado's archive. The information was incomplete, but sufficient to continue their work. How long before they realize what they've captured? Lash asked. Days, maybe weeks if we're fortunate. June studied her notes while calculating timing and resources. But we can't wait for them to act. We need to make the information public before they can suppress it. Agnes examined the rainfall correlations June had extracted from the glass plate documentation. These patterns match my weather records going back 15 years. Spring yields, seasonal variations, drought recovery rates. It's all consistent with what I've observed. The confirmation strengthened June's confidence in Salgado's work, while highlighting the urgency of their situation. The archive contained scientifically valid information that could guide sustainable water management across the territory. Information that Rook intended to use for monopolistic advantage rather than community benefit. We need a public demonstration, Ada said, something that shows the archive's value in terms everyone can understand. Leon nodded agreement. Proof that convinces skeptics and builds support for shared access to the information. June looked around the circle of faces, seeing determination mixed with understanding of the risks they were accepting. Rook had resources to make life difficult for anyone who challenged his territorial water plans. But Salgado's archive represented knowledge too valuable to surrender without a fight. Sister Agnes, how many people could your mission garden accommodate for a community meeting? 50 to 60 if we use the outdoor space. Agnes's eyes showed interest in the possibility. Though such gatherings tend to draw attention from people who prefer conducting business privately. Good, June said. We want attention. We want everyone to see what Salgado documented and understand how it could benefit the whole territory. As they made plans for a public revelation of the archive's contents, June felt the weight of commitment that came with choosing principle over safety. She'd started with a broken wagon bought for curiosity and found herself responsible for knowledge that could reshape the economic foundation of water rights. Whether that responsibility led to community empowerment or personal destruction would be determined by how effectively they could build public support before Rook's quiet hand found ways to silence them permanently. Lan Wen's workshop occupied a narrow building squeezed between the blacksmith's forge and the grain merchant's warehouse, its windows facing east to catch the best light for precision work. Clock movements, windmill gears, and mechanical puzzles filled every available surface, creating an organized chaos that spoke of a mind comfortable with complex systems. June found him bent over a peculiar contraption that combined elements of a magic lantern, a surveyor's transit, and what appeared to be a modified camera bellows. Steam rose from a kettle on his workbench as he cleaned glass lenses with the same methodical care he applied to watch mainsprings. Portable projection device, he explained without looking up from his work. If we're going to show Salgado's glass plates to a crowd, we need a way to make everyone see the same thing at once. The device represented Liang's synthesis of optical principles and mechanical ingenuity. An oil lamp provided illumination, mirrors focused and directed the light, and a system of lenses projected enlarged images of the glass plates onto any available surface. The entire apparatus folded into a carrying case no larger than a surveyor's instrument box. "How clear will the images be?" June asked, examining the lens arrangement with her trained eye for precision equipment. "Clear enough to read coordinates and flow patterns. Clear enough to show skeptics that we're dealing with scientific documentation, not folklore and guesswork." June had spent 3 days recreating the most important elements of Salgado's archive from memory and notes, working with Ada to decode the cultural symbols and with Sister Agnes to correlate the water data with local weather records. The result was incomplete compared to the original collection, but sufficient to demonstrate the archive's scope and accuracy. "We'll need multiple copies of the key plates," June decided. "If Rook's people try to confiscate or destroy evidence during the demonstration." Liang nodded toward a developing tray where several Lao's negatives lay soaking in chemical solutions. "Already working on that. The original plates were made with silver halide emulsion, expensive but precise. My copies use cheaper materials, but should be adequate for public viewing." The workshop door opened to admit Ada, carrying a bundle of textiles that proved to be white cotton sheets, sewn with reinforced edges and corner grommets. "Projection screens," she announced. "These can be hung between buildings or stretched across open spaces to display the images." Sister Agnes arrived as they were testing the projection apparatus, her arms full of ledger books and loose papers covered with careful handwriting. 15 years of rainfall measurements, crop yields, and community health records. "Everything that supports or contradicts the spring patterns shown in your archive." June appreciated the methodical approach Agnes brought to their preparation. Public demonstration of scientific information required supporting evidence that skeptics couldn't dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. Agnes's documentation provided the corroborating data that could transform Salgado's archive from curiosity into community risk. "What about the pump demonstration?" Ada asked. "People need to see the technology working, not just the maps that guide it." Lang gestured toward a corner of the workshop where he'd assembled a working model of Salgado's wind-driven pump. The device was smaller than the original, but incorporated the same principles of vane design and gear reduction that made the full-scale version so efficient. "This will lift water from a 10-foot depth with minimal wind power," he explained. "If we can find a suitable test site near the mission garden, we can show both the mapping information and the technology that makes it useful." June studied the model pump while considering the tactical aspects of their public demonstration. They needed to prove multiple points simultaneously: that Salgado's archive contained accurate information, that the pumping technology worked as documented, and that the combination could benefit the entire community rather than serving private interests. "We're asking people to accept a lot of new information at once," she observed. "Scientific data, traditional ecological knowledge, mechanical innovation, and a cooperative model for water management. Some folks will resist change regardless of evidence, which is why we need proof that can't be argued with," Ada said. "Demonstration of working technology producing actual results." Agnes spread her correlation charts across Lang's workbench, showing 15 years of data that supported the seasonal patterns documented in the glass plates. "The spring yield Salgado measured match my precipitation records within acceptable margins of error. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident." The documentation told a story that June found both encouraging and sobering. Salgado had spent years developing accurate methods for predicting and managing water resources in drought-prone territory. The work represented scientific achievement of considerable value, hidden in a wagon and abandoned when circumstances became dangerous. "Sister Agnes, how many people do you expect for the community meeting?" June asked. 40 to 50 from town, maybe another dozen from outlying ranches. Word travels fast when it concerns water resources. Agnes paused, her expression growing serious. But word also travels to people who might not appreciate public discussion of territorial water rights. The warning was tactfully delivered, but unmistakable. Rook's people would learn about the meeting and take appropriate measures to protect their interests. June's team needed to prepare for interference that could range from legal challenges to physical intimidation. "How long do we need for the full demonstration?" Lash asked, arriving with news about cooperative members who planned to attend the meeting. June calculated the time required to project key images, explain the correlation data, and demonstrate the pumping technology. 2 hours minimum, 3 hours if we allow time for questions and discussion. That's a long time to hold people's attention, while potential opposition organizes countermeasures, Lash observed. We should consider condensing the presentation to essential points. Lang looked up from calibrating his projection device. Essential points being what, exactly? June had been thinking about that question since their decision to go public with Salgado's information. The archive contained enough data to support weeks of technical discussion, but their audience would need clear, simple proof that the information could improve their lives. 3 essential points, she decided. First, that accurate mapping of water resources can help everyone plan more effectively. Second, that improved pumping technology can restore damaged rangeland at reasonable cost. Third, that cooperative management produces better results than individual competition. And fourth, Ada added that hoarding this information serves private profit, while sharing it serves community benefit. The political dimension of their demonstration couldn't be avoided. By making Salgado's archive public, they were challenging Rook's efforts to establish monopolistic control over territorial water resources. The challenge would provoke response, and that response would reveal the true stakes involved in their work. As evening approached, June's team completed preparations for what might be their only opportunity to present Salgado's information to the community before Rook's legal and financial resources overwhelmed their grassroots effort. Liang's projection device was tested and ready. Ada's screens were prepared for installation. Agnes's correlation data was organized for clear presentation. The model pump was cleaned and calibrated for demonstration. Everything depended on whether they could build sufficient public support before opposition forces found ways to silence them permanently. "One more thing," June said as they prepared to leave Liang's workshop. "If this demonstration succeeds, we need to be prepared for what comes next. Rook won't accept defeat gracefully, and territorial water rights law favors people with expensive lawyers." Agnes nodded grimly. "Which means we need more than proof. We need protection. Legal protection, political protection, and community protection." June understood the implication. Their demonstration would mark the beginning of a larger conflict rather than the resolution of a simple disagreement about water resources. Success would require sustained effort from people willing to defend their access to information that could reshape the economic foundation of drought country survival. Whether they had enough time and support to build that defense remained to be seen. The new moon cast no shadows across the county equipment yard as June, Lang, and Ruthie approached the fence line where impounded machinery sat in crooked rows like mechanical graveyards. The wagon rested near the back corner, its broken axle propped on wooden blocks and its canvas top folded down to expose the empty bed. June had spent 2 days studying the yard's layout from the grain elevator's second floor, timing the night watchman's rounds and identifying the best approach route. Getting inside would require 15 minutes of careful work with wire cutters and pry bars. Getting out with the wagon would require either considerable luck or Sheriff Mallory's cooperation. "Guard shack's lit," Ruthie whispered, pointing toward the small building near the front gate. "But I don't see movement." Lang consulted his pocket watch in the faint starlight. 11:45. "Next patrol should be midnight, then 2 o'clock if he maintains the pattern we observed." June studied the distance between the fence and the sheriff's office. calculating whether they could retrieve the wagon without waking half the town. The broken axle would make stealth impossible once they started moving, but Ada's diversions at the far end of Main Street should draw attention away from the yard. "Remember, we need the contents more than the wagon itself," June said. "If something goes wrong, priority is the archive materials." They approached the fence at its weakest point, where frost heave had loosened the post foundations and created gaps large enough for determined people to squeeze through. Lang's wire cutters made quick work of the bottom rail connections, opening a passage that would accommodate their needs without obvious damage to county property. The wagon sat exactly where Mallory had positioned it 3 days earlier, close enough to the office building to discourage casual theft, but far enough from the street to avoid unwanted attention. June had worried that Rook's people might have already examined the hidden compartments, but the false bed showed no signs of forced entry. Either they haven't found the archive yet, or they're waiting for proper documentation before opening it, she concluded. Lang began working on the axle repair, while June and Ruthie prepared to transfer the most critical materials to backup containers. The broken shaft required only temporary splinting to support the wagon's weight for a short journey, but the work needed to be silent and precise. A footstep on gravel made all three freeze until they identified the source. Sheriff Mallory emerging from the shadows near the office door, his hand resting on his pistol grip, but his posture more resigned than threatening. "Miss Hart, I was wondering when you'd make this attempt." June straightened slowly, her mind calculating distances and options while trying to read Mallory's intentions. "Sheriff, we're just recovering some personal property that got impounded by mistake." "Personal property?" Mallory stepped closer, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a man caught between competing pressures. "Would that be the surveying equipment, or the glass plates with water source documentation, or the mechanical innovations that could change how this territory manages drought?" The specificity of his knowledge surprised June. Mallory had clearly examined the wagon's contents more thoroughly than his official duties required, which meant he understood exactly what stakes they were dealing with. "All of it," she said honestly. "Information that belongs to the community, not to whoever has the best lawyers." Mallory considered this while studying the 3 people who'd risked arrest to retrieve knowledge that could benefit every water-dependent operation in the county. His decision-making process showed the same careful weighing of options June had observed in competent engineers and honest traders. "I've been sheriff here for 12 years, he said finally. "Seen plenty of disputes over water rights, mineral claims and grazing permits. Most times the people with money and connections get what they want, regardless of what's fair or beneficial for everyone else." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring of keys, the metal catching faint light from the distant guard shack. "But sometimes a man gets tired of enforcing laws that serve private interests while calling it public good." June accepted the keys with trembling hands, understanding that Mallory was crossing a line that would make him vulnerable to Rook's political pressure. "Sheriff, if you do this, there's no going back. Rook will make sure you pay for it. Maybe it's time for folks around here to see what happens when someone stands up to that kind of pressure." Mallory gestured toward the wagon. "Either way, if I'm going to help you, it has to be for everyone. No private deals, no exclusive arrangements. Whatever you found in that archive needs to benefit the whole community." June nodded agreement while Liam completed his emergency repair of the broken axle. The temporary fix would hold long enough to move the wagon to a secure location, but permanent restoration would require proper tools and materials. "We're planning a public demonstration tomorrow evening," she said. "Projection of the archive materials, correlation with local weather data, and working demonstration of the pumping technology. Complete transparency about what Salgado documented and how it can be used." Mallory helped them guide the wagon through the improvised gate opening, the wheels crunching softly on gravel as they navigated between impounded plows and broken windmills. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, but no lights appeared in nearby windows. "Public demonstration means public consequences," Mallory warned. Rook won't be content with legal maneuvering once you make this information widely available. June understood the warning. Public revelation would force direct confrontation between community interests and private monopolization. The conflict would escalate beyond quiet legal pressure into open political warfare, with uncertain outcomes for everyone involved. Then we'd better make sure the community understands what they're fighting for, she said. Dawn painted Sister Agnes's mission garden in shades of gold and amber. As townspeople and ranchers gathered among the carefully tended beds where drought-resistant vegetables grew in neat rows, Liang's projection apparatus stood ready between two cottonwood trees, its mirrors and lenses adjusted to catch the morning light that would illuminate Salgado's hidden archive for public viewing. June watched the crowd grow from her position near the mission steps, recognizing faces from the courthouse, the general store, and outlying ranches where water meant the difference between survival and failure. 43 people by her count, representing most of the cooperative families, plus curious townspeople drawn by word of unusual discoveries. Nervous? Ada asked, arranging the correlation charts that would support their presentation. Determined, June replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the first glass plate for projection. Everything depended on the next 2 hours whether they could build sufficient public understanding and support before Rook's people found ways to discredit or suppress the information. Lang made final adjustments to the projection device, while Sister Agnes positioned her rainfall ledgers for easy reference. The methodical preparation reminded June of survey crews organizing equipment before tackling difficult terrain. Success required proper tools and careful planning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agnes called, her clear voice carrying across the garden. "Thank you for gathering this morning to examine some remarkable discoveries about water resources in our territory." June stepped forward with the first glass plate, holding it to catch sunlight before placing it in Lang's apparatus. The projection bloomed across a white sheet stretched between fence posts, underground rivers mapped in delicate lines that flowed beneath surface geography. Everyone recognized, this is a photographic documentation of aquifer systems extending from the Mesa country to the railroad, June explained. Information gathered by a Mexican hydrologist named Isidoro Salgado, who spent years mapping water sources most of us never knew existed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized landmarks and calculated distances. The maps showed springs within walking distance of several ranches, aquifer connections that explained why some wells failed while others flourished, and seasonal patterns that matched their own observations about water availability. "How do we know this information is accurate?" called Tom Bradley, the freight operator who'd helped move June's wagon from the auction yard. Sister Agnes stepped forward with her ledgers open to rainfall correlation charts. 15 years of precipitation records show patterns that match these spring yields within 3% accuracy. That kind of consistency indicates scientific measurement, not guesswork. Liang projected a second plate showing the pump innovations that could extract water from previously impossible depths. The mechanical diagrams revealed engineering sophistication that impressed even skeptical observers, while cost calculations suggested restoration of damaged rancho at reasonable expense. The archive includes detailed specifications for wind-powered pumping equipment, June continued, technology that could restore failed wells and bring productivity back to drought-damaged ground. Ruthie Calder stepped forward with a jar of clear water drawn from her restored well. This came from ground that's been dead for 7 years. "One day's work with their pump system, and I've got better water than the town well provides." The demonstration continued with economic analysis provided by Lash Booker, whose cooperative model showed how shared resources and coordinated planning could benefit everyone involved. Individual competition for scarce water sources led to waste and conflict, while cooperative management produced sustainable yields and equitable distribution. "The archive contains information about more than water sources," Lash explained. "Seed varieties selected for drought resistance, soil restoration techniques, and sustainable pumping practices that maintain aquifer health over time." June projected images of the encoded seed envelopes, their multilingual labels revealing the international scope of Salgado's research. Traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous communities, combined with scientific innovation from Mexican agricultural colleges, creating a synthesis that served both cultural preservation and practical application. Sheriff Mallory appeared at the garden's edge as June prepared to discuss the political implications of making such information publicly available. His presence drew attention from several crowd members who understood the legal complexities surrounding water rights and territorial development. "Sheriff," June acknowledged, "any official concerns about our presentation?" Mallory stepped closer to examine the projected images, his expression showing professional interest in the technical documentation. "Official concern is maintaining public order and protecting community welfare. This information seems to serve both purposes." A rider approached from the direction of town, moving fast enough to suggest urgent business. June recognized Jonah Pike's controlled posture before she could make out his face, and she felt the crowd's attention shift toward potential confrontation. Pike dismounted near the garden gate and approached with papers in his hand, his manner suggesting official business rather than casual observation. "Miss Hart, I have an injunction requiring immediate cessation of this unauthorized public assembly." June accepted the legal document while maintaining her position near the projection apparatus. "On what grounds? Violation of territorial regulations regarding public dissemination of unverified hydrological data. Potential threat to public safety through promotion of experimental mechanical devices. Unlawful appropriation of proprietary research materials." The charges were carefully crafted to sound official, while creating legal confusion that could delay or prevent completion of their demonstration. Pike's timing suggested coordination with people who'd been monitoring their activities and waiting for the optimal moment to intervene. This information was abandoned property, legally purchased at public auction, Sister Agnes said firmly. "And this assembly is taking place on mission grounds, which enjoy certain protections under territorial law." Pike's smile suggested confidence in his legal position. "Perhaps we should let territorial courts determine the validity of those claims. In the meantime, I'm authorized to secure any materials that might constitute evidence in pending litigation." June looked around the circle of faces, ranchers and townspeople who'd gathered to learn about resources that could improve their lives, now facing legal intimidation designed to protect private interests. The moment required a choice between safety and principle that would define everyone's relationship to knowledge that belonged to the community. "The information stays public," she decided. "Whatever litigation follows, people have a right to know what resources exist and how they can be managed sustainably." Rook's riders closed the streets as Leung mounted his projection apparatus on the wagon, and Ada strung white sheets between buildings like flags of truce. The morning's garden demonstration had drawn larger crowds than anticipated, and word was spreading through town that something important was happening at the mission. June positioned mirrors to catch and redirect sunlight, creating a moving panorama of water source documentation that spilled across storefronts and painted Salgado's archive in light visible from 3 blocks away. If Pike wanted to suppress the information, he'd have to do it in front of the entire town. 22 riders, Lash reported from his position near the freight yards, positioned to control movement in and out of the central district. Professional operation, not casual intimidation. June noted the tactical implications while continuing to project images of spring locations and aquifer networks. Rook had committed significant resources to containing their revelation, which suggested both the value of what they'd discovered and the determination of people who intended to control it. Sister Agnes rang the mission bell, its bronze voice calling across the valley to draw out anyone who hadn't yet understood the significance of the morning's events. The sound echoed from canyon walls and carried for miles, a signal that could be heard at every ranch and homestead in the territory. "They're trying to cut telegraph service," Ruthie called from her position near the general store. "Pike's got men at the dip." Lang adjusted his apparatus to project the pump specifications onto the courthouse wall, the mechanical diagrams appearing 30 feet tall and visible to anyone within sight of the town center. If they want to isolate us, we'll make sure everyone sees what we found before they succeed. The glass plates rolled in sequence, spring yields and seasonal patterns, aquifer connections and sustainable pumping practices, seed varieties and soil restoration techniques. A complete education in water management projected across buildings in broad daylight, impossible to ignore or suppress without obvious heavy-handed tactics. June had calculated this strategy during the long nights of preparation, understanding that their only protection lay in making the information too public to suppress quietly. Rook could silence individuals, but silencing an entire community would require methods that exposed his true intentions. Ruthie drove the model pump to the town square and began demonstration of water lifting from a shallow test well. Liang had prepared the previous evening, in front of a growing crowd. Wind caught the device's precisely balanced vanes, and clear water rose through pipes that had been bone dry moments before. The practical demonstration supported the theoretical information being projected onto surrounding buildings. People could see both the documentation of water resources and the technology that made those resources accessible, understanding viscerally how Salgado's archive could transform their relationship to drought and scarcity. Sheriff Mallory appeared at the square's edge with 3 deputized townspeople, their presence creating a perimeter that held Pike's riders at a respectful distance. The lawman's decision to protect the demonstration rather than suppress it sent a clear message about where local authorities stood on questions of community access to vital information. Jonah Pike, Mallory called across the square. You're welcome to observe this public assembly, but interference with peaceful demonstration of scientific information would constitute violation of territorial assembly rights. Pike's response came in the form of a drawn pistol, though he held it low rather than raising it towards specific targets. The weapon's appearance shifted the atmosphere from political confrontation toward potential violence, an escalation that could justify extreme measures from either side. Senator chose that moment to express his opinion about firearms in his vicinity. The mule's bray echoed across the square with indignant volume, followed by a sideways step that put him directly between Pike and the projection apparatus. The movement looked accidental but placed Pike's shot line toward an animal known for unpredictable responses to sudden movement. The shot went wide when Pike fired, the bullet striking wooden siding harmlessly, while Semaphore completed his evasive maneuver with the satisfied air of a mule who'd solved an obvious problem. Mallory moved immediately to disarm Pike while his deputies restrained the riders who'd started forward at the sound of gunfire. Jonah Pike, you're under arrest for discharging a firearm within town limits and threatening public safety during a lawful assembly. Mallory's voice carried the authority of a man who'd found his moral footing after months of uncomfortable compromise. June continued projecting images while Pike was led away in restraints, understanding that the confrontation had reached a point where retreat was impossible for either side. Rook would escalate rather than accept defeat, which meant the community needed to prepare for sustained pressure rather than celebrating temporary victory. How long can we maintain this? Ada asked, helping Liang reload the projection apparatus with backup plates they'd prepared for extended demonstration. As long as necessary, June replied, though she knew their resources were limited and Rook's were not. The information is public now. Even if they stop us here, people in other towns will hear about what we found and demand access to the same resources. Lash approached with news from his cooperative network. Words traveling fast along the freight route. Other communities are asking questions about water rights and territorial development policies. This is becoming larger than just our local situation. June studied the crowd that continued to grow as more people arrived from outlying areas, drawn by the bell and the unprecedented sight of scientific information projected across their town in broad daylight. The demonstration had succeeded in making Salgado's archive public property, but success had also made everyone involved visible targets for retaliation. Whether they could protect what they'd gained remained to be seen. But the choice between community knowledge and private monopolization had been made clear for everyone to witness and judge. On courthouse steps worn smooth by decades of legal proceedings, a hand-lettered document spread across a makeshift table while townspeople gathered to witness something unprecedented in territorial history. The Spring and Seed Cooperative Charter outlined principles that challenged every assumption about water rights, resource ownership, and community governance. "Open ledgers," Sister Agnes read aloud, her clear voice carrying across the square. "Rotation of stewards, posted yields, emergency shares, and prohibition of exclusive deeds to water sources documented in the Salgado archive." June signed last, her signature committing her to leadership as service rather than ownership. The charter designated her as founding steward, but the position carried term limits and community oversight that prevented individual control of the cooperative's resources. Leon installed a permanent projection lantern at the town hall, its brass fittings gleaming with the precision of a master craftsman's work. Ada's teaching cloths hung nearby, their woven patterns encoding water-finding knowledge for future generations to study and preserve. A letter arrived in Rook's familiar hand. "Enjoy your little fountain. Rivers rise and fall." The threat was delicately worded but unmistakable. This victory was temporary, and larger battles lay ahead. June studied an unlabeled crate left in the wagon's deepest compartment, its contents revealing Salgado's final note: "The second map lives where wind is born." Beyond the horizon, wind farm ridges promised additional archives waiting for discovery by people willing to seek knowledge that belonged to everyone. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.